Yes, we're looking this week at the Exodus, and I am here to talk to you about sex. Well, I see I got your attention. Actually, I'm not going to be talking to you about sex, but in a way, I sort of am because when we look at the sin of the golden calf, and we could call it more than a sin, maybe an utter fiasco, there is quite a bit of sexual innuendo in it. And I think the most obvious place to look at this is Exodus 32, where the sin begins in verse 6. It says, they rose up early in the morning, offered burnt offerings, offered peace offerings. The people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And now, most scholars today will argue that the rose up to play is a rather obscure idiom for stripped naked and had an orgy. So right away you see that there's actually quite a bit more going on with this sin of the golden calf, which the text is sort of a little bit delicate in talking about than maybe would be portrayed in the rather unfortunate depiction in the Ten Commandments above. I mean, that movie has so many problems with it. Well, anyway, we can talk more about that in a second, but I want to talk to you a little bit about the golden calf in the interpretive tradition. We tend to trivialize it today for reasons I'll get into in a second, but the ancients actually saw a great amount of depth in the narrative. One of the things that they noticed was that the sin was really a profound rejection of what God had just done, the liberation that he had just achieved for them. Thomas Aquinas interpreted the sin of the golden calf, or as he called it, the sin of the molten calf, as Israel systematically breaking every one of the commandments that God had just given. So in other words, it's not just a minor breach we're talking about here, it's an utter apostasy, it's an utter repudiation. And it's very interesting that the rabbis in the rabbinical tradition, not all of them, but a good number of them, saw in the sin of the golden calf, in some ways, a recapitulation of what Adam had done in the Garden of Eden. Just as Adam had, in effect, turned his back on his creator, in effect, spurning the gift of dominion over all creation, which God had so graciously bestowed on him, in a way, Israel had done something analogous by turning her back on her divine Redeemer, who had just given himself, in effect, to pull her out of the land of Egypt. The rabbis in some ways saw this as being equally catastrophic and a clear forfeiture in some ways of the very gifts that God had meant to bestow on Israel in place of Adam. Notice here that there's a certain salvation historical narrative in this presupposed even within Judaism. So you can see here salvation history is not entirely a Christian Catholic phenomenon. But what's of course interesting about this is that the sin of the golden calf, in some ways, so over the top in terms of what it did. In other words, you look at this and you see, how could they have been so bloody stupid? I mean, how could they have fallen for the not only this complete apostasy, but why would Aaron have done such a thing, and why would the Israelites in effect have demanded this of Aaron? So that there's this huge question here in terms of what the real nature of this sin is, and how we can really sort of identify with it. There's a good rule of thumb, a pro tip here, if you will, that if ever there's a sin in the Old Testament that you see, which is committed and which the people are punished for, or in some ways not immediately punished for, but it's very clear in the narrative that it is a sin and a serious breach of charity, and it's a sin and you can't yourself see yourself committing such a sin, or you can't even see why anyone in any circumstances would commit such a sin, you haven't really yet understood it. In other words, there's obviously something there you're missing. So when we now think a little bit about what a golden bowl represents, just in terms of its symbolism, it's not so difficult to see actually what's going on. If you think about, first of all, the gold aspect to it, the bowl is a symbol of wealth. It's a symbol of prosperity. It's a symbol, in effect, of all the things that the Israelites had to leave behind in Egypt. You remember they're slaves in Egypt, of course, but in fact, they don't have it really all that badly in Egypt. And indeed, just the normal ebb and flow of Egyptian life is a far more desirable existence on many levels than the type of existence that they're now going to have in the wilderness. So the gold really symbolizes prosperity, in effect, wealth that they're leaving behind. And of course, the bull also symbolizes something else. The bull is a very powerful animal. It's powerful in the natural realm. It's a strong animal. It can pull things. It can do a lot of damage. So it symbolizes, in a way, political power, or any kind of power, any kind of masculine power that can be twisted to destructive ends. It also is a useful animal in that the bull actually serves one function, in the context of animal husbandry, and that's to impregnate the various female cows, the cows, ultimately to produce more and more livestock. So the bull is really a symbol of male fertility, and especially masculine fertility. In other words, the sort of worship of procreation, and the worship in effect of sexuality and sexual power all of itself. The bull's a very, very powerful animal as well. So now, if you sort of take away the religious aspect to it too, and forget about the sacrificial aspect, that's the part we have a little bit of trouble identifying with, living as we are in a very post-Enlightenment world in which religious symbolism, ancient religious symbolism, seemed very strange to us. Give the ancients a little bit of credit. They're not actually worshiping a bull as God. They're worshiping what, in effect, the bull represents. In other words, the sort of powers of nature, the forces of nature, of power, sex, money, of force, of procreation, procreative power, and wealth. And all of these things that they represent in the natural realm, they're ultimately deities behind, and of course they can't see the deities, and so the bull becomes one of many possible symbols in which these powers can be brought alive. And so once we begin to see that, then we begin to see, yes, they are continually drawn in the heart to the various things they left behind in Egypt. As the old saying goes, you can take Israel out of Egypt, but it's really hard, in effect, to take Egypt out of Israel. And that really becomes the problem in this particular narrative. Now, there's a little bit of a joke about this as well. If you notice that this sin of the golden calf follows upon a whole kind of cycle of rebellion in the wilderness, where very frequently the people are complaining about not having anything to eat. And, many skeptics in some places, in some cases even scholars, will say this is a contradiction. I mean, they've got cattle, that the text says in many cases they have cattle that they brought out of Egypt. Why didn't they eat the cattle if they were so hungry on the way? And of course, the answer is that because the cattle have in effect been sacralized. The cattle really represent wealth, power, fertility, in effect, all of the gods, in effect, that the natural realm can convey, but which ultimately divide the heart of the people from pure devotion to Yahweh, who has redeemed them and rescued them from all of this. So in other words, there's a great amount of good, solid teaching and preaching that we can get out of this in a very, very practical way, if we just use a little bit of imagination when we're interpreting it. One of the problems with the Edward G. Robinson account is not only is Edward G. Robinson horribly miscast as Aaron, but there's a tendency to make the sin very, very trivial and make it seem as absurd and ridiculous, as something we would never ourselves do, and so we can kind of look down on the poor, helpless, benighted people of the past as these idiots who do things that seem ridiculous to us, and we ourselves would never under any circumstances do. And of course, Now we see that that's a very, very glib and superficial interpretation of the story. That indeed, that slaying, our own golden calves is in some way is not the easiest commandment, but in some ways for us is by far the most difficult one, because we all have our golden calves that we have to put to death, and at the very let alone not turn into to idols for us to worship and in effect to bend our whole lives around. Okay, well, that's my little teaching on the golden calf, and enjoy this week's lesson.